Christmas is a time of bright lights, comforting songs and warm reunions with loved ones. It is a time when traditions come to life, bringing feelings of nostalgia and magic. But what many don't realize is that behind this veil of joy, Christmas also has its dark side. For centuries, winter nights have been associated with terrifying legends, macabre figures, and stories that defy logic. Did you know that some Christmas traditions were born from frightening myths? Krampus, for example, is a folkloric figure who accompanies Santa Claus in some European cultures. While he rewards good children, Krampus has a much more sinister role, punishing those who have misbehaved by dragging them into dark forests. In other corners of the world, stories of spirits that roam the long nights of December have gained traction, suggesting that not every Christmas gift is received with joy. And what about real stories that happen during this festive season? Have you ever heard stories of people who mysteriously disappeared on Christmas Eve? Or unexplained encounters in homes decorated with garlands and lights? There's something particularly unsettling about spooky events that occur during a time that's supposed to be filled with peace and harmony. That's exactly what we're going to explore today. 3 frightening but true stories that happened during Christmas. These aren't just legends or fictional tales. They're accounts of real people who experienced the unthinkable, transforming the holiday spirit into something they'll never forget. In the first story, you'll meet a family who discovered that not even the walls of their home could protect them from the horror. In the second, a Christmas gift brought with it something no one would ever expect. And finally, in the last story, a snow-covered road became the scene of a disturbing encounter that defies any rational explanation. Christmas is often described as the quietest night of the year. But for those who've experienced these experiences, the silence was just the prelude to something terrifying. Now, prepare to enter the darkness behind the Christmas lights. Our first story begins with an old house, covered in snow, and a family who would soon discover that Christmas can be just as scary as any other time of the year. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow was falling softly, covering everything in a flawless blanket of white. The Mitchell family had just moved into an old house in the Maine countryside, looking for a fresh start. The house, built in the early 1900s, had a charming exterior with large windows and a porch decorated with twinkling Christmas lights. To anyone passing by, it looked like the perfect setting for a Christmas card. But inside, the atmosphere was beginning to change. Evening had fallen, and the Mitchells were cozy in the living room, around the fireplace. Father Peter was reading a book while his wife Linda decorated the last of the gingerbread cookies. Their youngest daughter, Emma, 8, was excitedly dancing to the Christmas carols playing softly on the radio. Everything seemed perfect, until Emma looked out the window. "Daddy, there's someone outside," she said, her voice innocent but firm enough to make Peter put down his book. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. All he saw was the snow-covered yard and the tree branches swaying in the wind. "It's just your imagination, honey. It's too cold for anyone to be out there," he replied with a reassuring smile. Emma didn't press the issue, but something in her eyes seemed troubled. Hours passed, and the family went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, Peter was awakened by a strange sound, something like heavy footsteps creaking on the porch. He got up, pulled on a coat over his pajamas, and looked out the bedroom window. There he was, a tall man in a dark coat and an old-fashioned hat, standing in the dim light of the Christmas lights, staring at the house. Peter went downstairs, his heart pounding. He grabbed a baseball bat from the closet next to the door and carefully opened the door. "Hey, who's there?" he called out. The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned and started walking toward the woods at the back of the property. Peter hesitated for a moment, but decided not to go. He locked the door and checked all the windows before returning to his room, trying to convince himself that he was just a vagrant looking for shelter. The next morning, Peter found deep footprints in the snow, leading from the woods to the living room window where Emma had been the night before, and then to the porch. Something didn't make sense. Why would someone just stand there, looking into the house, without making contact? The next few days were marked by growing unease. Linda began hearing soft knocks on the windows in the early morning hours. Emma said she saw the man again, standing under the Christmas tree in the backyard, even though Peter insisted that no one was there. The tension in the house was rising, and the sense of security was quickly disappearing. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve. While the family was in the living room, listening to stories and opening presents, the lights on the tree began to flicker. Emma, who was sitting by the window, froze and pointed with her finger. "He's here." Peter ran to the door, but when he opened it, he saw nothing, just cold emptiness and falling snow. When he looked back, Linda was holding Emma, while the girl's gaze remained fixed on the window. "He's out there, looking at us," she whispered, her voice almost broken. Unsure of what to do, Peter called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the area but found no one. Only the same footprints, leading back and forth from the woods. "It must be someone playing a prank or trying to scare you," the officers said, but their expressions showed that they were suspicious too. The next morning, Emma handed Peter a drawing she had made. It was of a tall man in a dark coat and hat, looking out the window. She said she drew it because the man kept smiling at her, and it made her uncomfortable. The following weeks brought temporary relief, but the Mitchells decided to sell the house soon after. Before they moved in, Peter investigated the property records and discovered that decades ago, a man had mysteriously disappeared into the woods behind the house on Christmas Eve. Some believed he returned every year, looking for something or someone. For the Mitchells, Christmas was never the same again. If this story left you feeling uneasy, brace yourself, because the next one reveals that not every Christmas gift is welcome. Sometimes, it can carry something much darker than we imagine. Henry wasn't the kind of person who cared about Christmas. At 27, he lived alone in a small mountain town, far from friends and family. He worked freelance, which meant he could avoid the holidays and spend the season alone in his cabin, surrounded by the silence of the snow. There were no presents, no forced gatherings, just the way he liked it. But that year, something unusual happened. On the morning of December 24th, Henry woke to the sound of something being left on his porch. When he opened the door, he found a gift, wrapped in bright red paper and a gold bow. There was no note, no indication of who had left it there. He looked around, but no one was there. The untouched snow on the ground showed no footprints, which disconcerted him. Henry wasn't one to be easily impressed, but something about the gift bothered him. He brought it inside and set it on the table, deciding to ignore it. Maybe it was a neighbor trying to be friendly, even though he rarely spoke to anyone in the area. However, as the day wore on, his curiosity got the better of him. He undid the ribbon and carefully tore off the paper. Inside the box was an antique doll. Made of porcelain, it had a pale face and vivid blue eyes, almost lifelike. She was dressed in period clothing, a white dress with gold trim that looked as if it had been handmade. Henry frowned. He didn't like dolls. In fact, he found them disturbing. Who would think this would make a good gift? He muttered to himself as he put the doll back in the box. That night, while reading a book, Henry began to hear small cracking sounds. He ignored it at first, attributing the sound to the wood of the cabin adjusting to the bitter cold. But the noises seemed to be coming from the table where the doll was sitting. He got up and walked over to it, but found nothing wrong. Just the doll, motionless, with that fixed, piercing stare. Later, in bed, Henry had trouble sleeping. He felt as if he were being watched. He tried to push the thought away, but the feeling was overwhelming. When he finally managed to fall asleep, he had a terrible nightmare. He dreamed that he was trapped in a dark room, with a doll sitting in a chair in the corner. In the dream, she smiled at him, and the smile turned into a high-pitched laugh that echoed as if there were several voices. Henry woke up in a cold sweat, only to realize something that made his heart race. The doll, which he had left on the table, was now sitting in the chair next to the bed, staring at him. His throat felt dry and the air felt heavier. Trembling, he picked up the doll and threw it back into the box, locking it in the closet. The next day, the mood in the cabin was strange. The lights flickered for no reason, and the popping noises continued. Henry tried to convince himself that these were just coincidences, but as night approached, his uneasiness grew. He decided to investigate the doll further and searched the internet. After a few hours of research, he found a creepy story about a family who had lived in the same area decades ago. A little girl had received a doll for Christmas, similar to the one Henry had, and soon after, tragedies began to happen. The entire family disappeared, and the cabin where they lived burned down. As the night wore on, the events became more intense. Objects began to fall from the shelves, and Henry heard footsteps shuffling through the cabin. When he finally went to confront the closet, the box was open, and the doll was no longer there. In desperation, Henry left the cabin, carrying only a flashlight. He walked through the snow, trying to fight off the panic, but it seemed like something was following him. Looking back, he saw the doll standing at the entrance to the cabin, staring straight at him. He ran into the woods, stumbling in the snow, until he finally lost sight of the dim light of his cabin. Henry was found days later by locals, disoriented and showing signs of hypothermia. He never spoke of what happened that night, but the cabin was abandoned. Years later, urban explorers who visited the site reported hearing children's laughter and finding a porcelain doll in a corner, her dress covered in dust but her eyes as bright as ever. If you thought it was disturbing what a Christmas present could bring, wait until you hear what happened on the loneliest night of the year, on a deserted road. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow was falling thickly, covering the roads and turning everything around into an endless blanket of white. Megan was driving alone on a country road, trying to get to her parents' house before midnight. She had left work late, and the drive, which normally took 2 hours, seemed endless on this cold, lonely night. The winding road was deserted. The only lights visible were the headlights of her car and, occasionally, the Christmas decorations of some distant house. Megan glanced at the clock on the dashboard, calculating how much time she had left until she arrived. She was used to driving alone, but tonight felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, and the silence heavier. As she adjusted the heater, something ahead caught her eye. In the middle of the road, there was a figure, standing in the snow. Megan braked sharply, almost skidding on the ice. With her heart racing, she looked at the person. It was a woman, dressed in clothes that seemed old-fashioned, a long dress and a shawl, unsuitable for the cold. The woman slowly raised her hand, asking for a ride. Megan hesitated. Something about the figure seemed off, but she couldn't bring herself to simply ignore it. After all, it was Christmas, and the idea of leaving someone on that deserted road seemed cruel. After a moment of indecision, she rolled down the window and asked, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't answer, but walked slowly to the passenger door. Megan unlocked the car, and the woman got in without saying a word. She was pale, her face partially hidden by her shawl, and her gaze was far away. "Where are you going?" Megan asked, trying to sound casual, but the woman simply replied, "Home." The drive continued in silence. Megan tried to make conversation, but the woman gave short, almost mechanical answers. When she asked where home was, the woman pointed ahead, as if her destination was in the same direction Megan was already heading. The feeling of unease grew, but Megan convinced herself that she was just imagining things. After a few minutes, Megan noticed something strange. Despite the extreme cold, the woman didn't seem to be feeling any discomfort. Her hands, which were holding the shawl, were bare and completely exposed to the icy wind that was coming in through the cracks in the car. Furthermore, the rear-view mirror showed only the empty seat where the woman should have been sitting. Megan tried not to panic, but her mind was racing. She looked directly at the woman, who was now watching her with fixed, almost unblinking eyes. It was then that the woman spoke again, in a low, calm voice. "You need to stop." "Stop? What do you mean?" Megan asked, trying to maintain control. The woman repeated more firmly, "Stop now." Reluctantly, Megan pulled the car over to the shoulder. As soon as the vehicle stopped, the woman pointed to a spot on the road, a few meters ahead. "There. That's where I was." Confused, Megan looked at the indicated place, but saw nothing but the accumulated snow. When she turned back, the woman was no longer there. The passenger seat was empty, and the door was locked. Megan felt a shiver run through her body and instinctively stepped on the gas, wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. A few minutes later, she saw flashing lights in the distance. It was a police roadblock. Relieved to see other people, Megan stopped the car and got out. The officers explained that there had been a serious accident on the highway hours earlier. A truck had skidded and collided with a car, killing the driver instantly. When Megan asked where the accident had occurred, they pointed to the same spot where the woman had pulled her over. Later, when she described the woman to the officers, they seemed puzzled. One of the officers explained that the description perfectly matched the driver of the car that had been hit. She had been trying to get home that night, but never made it. Megan could never forget what happened. After that night, she avoided driving on deserted roads and carried with her a burden she could barely explain. To this day, when he looks at the passenger seat on Christmas Eve, he swears he feels the presence of someone beside him. Someone who never made it to the end of their journey. Christmas Eve is full of magic, but as we have seen, this magic is not always comforting. Some stories show us that there are forces we do not understand, and that not even the brightest time of the year can completely dispel the darkness. Christmas has always been a time of joy, celebration, and togetherness. But as we've seen in these stories, there's a dark side that often goes unnoticed, an unexplained presence that seems to emerge in the silence of the coldest, loneliest nights. It's a reminder that behind the twinkling lights and comforting music, the world is more mysterious and frightening than we can imagine. The first story, with the man in the window, showed us that we can't always trust the physical confines of safety. The Mitchells' snowbound home seemed like a perfect haven until something, or someone, began to invade their nights. Who was this man? A lost spirit, doomed to retrace his steps on Christmas Eve, or something even more sinister? The answer, perhaps, lies in the mind of Emma, the only one who seemed to truly see him. In the second story, the Christmas present became a reminder that not every act of kindness is innocent. Henry learned the hard way that the past can haunt us in tangible ways. What did the doll really want? Was she a bearer of tragedies from another time, or something worse, something that fed on the fear of those who crossed her path? And finally, the third story brought us proof that even in the solitude of a deserted road, we can find companionship, although not always desirable. Megan's experience was an encounter with the unexplainable, an apparition that saved her from a fate similar to that of the mysterious woman. But why? Was the soul of that woman trapped in a cycle, warning others to avoid the same fate? These stories are not only frightening, they also make us think about the fine lines between the real and the supernatural. What is more terrifying? The idea that these things really happen, or the fact that we will never have all the answers? As you reflect on what you have heard, consider what these stories can teach us. Perhaps they are warnings, reminders that curiosity has its price and that the unknown is not always something we should seek to explore. Or perhaps they are simply stories, tales to keep our minds occupied on dark, cold nights. Either way, they remind us that Christmas, while a magical time, is also a time when the darkness seems closer, lurking just beyond the twinkling lights. So as you turn out the lights tonight, you might do a double take at the window or the darkest corner of your room. Who knows what might be watching, waiting, or looking for you? And with that, we end the 3 scary true Christmas horror stories. I hope these stories sent a chill down your spine and that you never look at Christmas the same way again. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more scary stories like these, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and share with your friends. After all, there's nothing like a little terror to warm up the cold December nights. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, if you can sleep,